please give a Bio-IT World welcome to Dr. Bourne. Philip?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Sanjay. So how many people here have actually looked at the 10 Simple Rules series, just out of interest? Oh, actually a few. So it's really a professional development series that came about as not many years ago, 95. I was asked by the Student Council of the International Society of Computational Biology to come and, we just started the journal, and they wanted me to come and talk about how to be published. How do I get published? So I went along to this meeting thinking there would be like 15 graduates, desperately looking graduate students in the audience, and was surprised when actually more people than this actually showed up to have a discussion about how to get published. It wasn't anything I had to say, it was because I'd made the slides on the plane on the way to the meeting, as usual, but it was really the dialogue that we all had together. And I came away from this so sort of charged with everything that happened. I thought, I've got to try and capture what happened. So I wrote this little piece called 10 Simple Rules for Getting Published. That actually turned out to be very highly downloaded in PLOS. That led to other ideas like 10 Simple Rules for Writing a Review, 10 Simple Rules for Getting a Grant. And these aren't all written by me. They're written by the whole community now has got engaged in doing this and developing this really lovely professional development series. So to me, that was sort of a really nice thing to happen. The Australian connection is not that long ago. I was at a meeting and an Australian graduate student came up to me and said, I got this great idea for a new entry in the 10 Simple Rules series. It's 10 Simple Rules for writing 10 Simple Rules. So that was my sign that the series had actually become a success because people were writing. And one of those rules, one of the rules was you've got to have a new and novel idea. And they suggested a couple. One was, how to win a Nobel Prize. And Rich Roberts was kind enough to write that. He was really annoyed when I asked him to write it because he said, this is the last thing we should be encouraging students to actually think about. And I said, well, that's easy for you to say because you've already won a Nobel Prize. But then he went on and we had a bit of discussion about it, and I said, look, if that's the way you feel about it, write that as 10 Simple Rules, which he did, and I encourage you to look at it. The other one that was suggested was 10 Simple Rules for Knowing When to Retire. I'm actually going to write that myself, probably as soon as I finish this lecture. Okay, so that's got absolutely nothing to do with what I'm going to tell you right now, but it was a lot of fun to do, and I still work with the Public Library of Science, and I'm an absolute advocate and believer in open access. So I suspect that's going to sort of filter out in what I'm going to say. But I'm just going to tell you a little about what we're doing at the NIH. And I say we. Andrea Norris is here in the audience. She's the CIO of NIH. And she's been absolutely instrumental in sort of helping move this along. And I've just come along in the last year to help out. And it's been a blast so far, even though we are working for the federal government. So let me just give you a sort of sense of the vision that we put together for what we're doing. It's sort of embodied in this vision statement. It's a bunch of words, so it doesn't really necessarily mean that much. The part that's in italics is taken directly from the NIH mission statement, and we've just sort of added around it the notion of what we're doing in this era of data. So it's the idea we're trying that in this era of data, what's happening, of course, is biomedical research is effectively becoming digitized at every step of the research life cycle. And that's, in essence, what we call calling it a digital enterprise. And what we're desperately trying to do is to make that more of an ecosystem than it currently is. Because what happens now is, we fund a whole bunch of things, people go off and do some very interesting things, some of them have profound impact. But often the data and the software and some of the narrative and the workflows and everything associated with those experiments really just atrophies away over time. That doesn't feed back, it isn't hardened, it isn't developed, it isn't really made into a more efficient system. And that's really what I went to the NIH to try and help happen. But I think prerequisite to that, the reason I decided to go when I did, is because I felt it's because the time is right. And I want to give you sort of 4 examples of what drives us and why I think the time is right. So the first one, how many people have read this book? A few, okay. Actually more than read of the 10 Simple Rules series, I might note. But this is clearly about the idea that we're in the second industrial age, if you like. That we had the Industrial Revolution, now we have this second revolution, driven in part, of course, by Moore's Law. But I think the theme of this book is more the notion that things are happening much faster than we anticipated. So that's embodied, and I'll just take, these are all of these examples are evidence of that. I'll just give you one. So the idea that Google car, I think people were surprised that for the last 2 or 3 years we've had a self-drive car that certainly drives better than most people in California. And it does so by ingesting 750 megabytes of data and processing them per second in real time to actually define that, to enable that to happen. So it's really a sort of example. This has happened sort of faster than people thought. Another book, I don't know if people have read this one, but this sort of puts this in a slightly different perspective, which I actually like, which is the notion of these 6 Ds of exponential growth. So, and you can actually map lots of different kinds of events to these 6 Ds, which I'll describe in terms of healthcare in a second. But just, you know, you can imagine, just think about it in the whole emergence of digital photography. The digitization was obviously invention of the digital camera, which Kodak shelved for a long time, which proved to be a mistake, obviously. Then we went into a deceptive phase, into various other phases around the big D. So let's just look at those in the context of healthcare, because I would argue, and whether this is true or not remains to be seen, but I would argue that we have entered the digitization era, okay? You might say, well, we've been there a long time. Well, I'm not so sure. Certainly, you know, good parts of what we were doing in basic and clinical research have been digital for a while. But really, the sort of emergence of the electronic health record as, you know, a real useful, potentially useful, if you like, research tool, I think is really an indicator that things are moving along. And what I would argue is we're kind of in this deceptive phase, which happens at the low period in the exponential growth. So things are changing, but they're changing at this point at least slowly. And you don't necessarily fully appreciate those changes. But then things start to ramp up, and we reach this disruptive phase, which I don't think we've reached yet with respect to biomedical research and healthcare. And then what remains to be seen, but certainly has happened in other areas, you get into this demonetization, this dematerialization phase, where effectively the business models around all of this change. That obviously happened with respect to, say, you know, going back to digital photography. First, we had the emergence of the digital camera and the complete loss of the chemical market around film. And then, of course, the digital camera market basically went out the window with a smartphone. And then, of course, the business models actually changed completely, and we were left with Instagram and so on having enormous evaluations while everything else was falling by the wayside. So that was, but it also democratized the kinds of things that were happening. And to me, that's really the kind of excitement that, that emerges out of this. And the way I think about what would happen in the healthcare arena around democratization is the idea, for the first time in history, that the patient is at the center of the healthcare system. That may seem a bit odd, but I don't actually think that person has been there in that way ever yet. But we're actually getting there because the patient has command, or will have command, of their own information. And they can use it effectively. So I think these are the kind of disruptors for me that are important. There are other disruptors which I also come to this sort of democratization aspect, which I think are really interesting. And I've told this story many times, and I never tire of telling it, and probably half of you in this audience have heard it already, if you ever heard me speak before. But this is just an example of democratization. So, I don't know, several years ago now, I got a paper sent to the PLOS journal I was editor-in-chief of, and it was written by a single author. And it was a paper on pandemic modeling. And instead of sending it to the journal office for processing, the author, Meredith, had sent it directly to me. Well, normally I would have just sent that off to the journal office, because people send them to me because they think I'm a soft touch, they're going to get published more easily. But normally I wouldn't look at it, but I looked at this because it was kind of special. I sent it to Simon Levine, who's an expert in large-scale modeling, and a Kyoto Prize winner at Princeton, to look at. And he said, yeah, this is a very interesting methodology. And so I was so intrigued by this, you'll see the point in a minute, if you don't know it already. I decided to meet with the author, who happened to live in San Diego, which is where I was at the time. So she came, we had coffee, we talked about the paper. I was so impressed, I decided to invite her to give a lecture at UCSD. She then went on to Princeton to give a lecture, and all was well. So what's the big deal about this story? Well, the big deal was she was 15 years old. So she was a senior at La Jolla High School. She started doing this as a science fair project. She then went on to, she wrote to Wolfram and got a copy of Mathematica to do some of the modeling. She wrote to the San Diego Supercomputer Center and got hundreds of thousands of hours of free computing. And so she was able to, essentially conduct a very detailed scientific experiment. In the end, the paper was reviewed by Science and subsequently published elsewhere. But it's just an example of the fact that in some ways anyone can contribute. And there are other examples of this. So, the challenges are a great example. Quite often those challenges, so here's one here, Wei-Yi Cheng was a graduate assistant when he helped, he came up with a breast cancer biomarker, and he wasn't even an expert in this area. But he did a better job than the experts in this area. So I think we're in this kind of time of disruption, and it really, the idea is that within the context of what we're doing at the NIH, we should, in some ways, begin to try and embrace these kinds of disruptions and use them effectively for the benefit of the health and well-being of the American public. So that's sort of, what we're trying to do. And so, we're running challenges to bring out these kinds of people. And I'm going to give you other examples of things we're doing where, we're trying to sort of shake the tree in a little different way. This was already alluded to, but just in a different context, we now have this issue of the ability to replicate experiments. Just before I left UCSD, about a little over a year ago, I actually wrote a paper with some other people which was effectively titled, "I Cannot Reproduce Work from My Own Lab." You can tell I was leaving science and moving on to something else, so I didn't really care anymore. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't that I couldn't replicate this work from my own lab. It was the amount of effort that it took to replicate it. It's the usual story. We had a paper. It was a purely in silico pipeline. And there was 4 authors on the paper. I was the last author. The first author had, basically gone off to industry, and she'd done most of the work. So she was still around, and she couldn't remember where the scripts were or where the bits and pieces of data were. We were ultimately able to reconstruct things, because I was useless. I was the PI at the end of the list of authors. The idea that I was going to be able to contribute anything meaningful to this paper was totally out of the question. But these are just examples. And in the end, we tried to quantify what it took to reproduce the work at various stages. And it effectively took 180 hours to reproduce that piece of work. Well, there's no surprises to any graduate student new to a lab where the PI says, well, I want you to pick up where so-and-so left off and do this and this and this. You know that that's not going to be straightforward. So it's not that some of that is bad. I mean, the idea that you sort of, in a sense, relearn some of these things is good. But is this the most efficient way to be doing science? And you can argue that not necessarily. It becomes more profound when you see these kinds of situations where you can imagine what the implications are. You have a congressman, congresswoman sitting there who just happens to be on the Appropriations Committee for NIH. She reads in the newspaper that so many, 47 out of 53 landmark seminal papers in cancer research cannot be reproduced. And there you are looking at an appropriation of $4.8 billion a year. And you start to think, should I be giving them all this money if they can't reproduce their work? This would have profound impact on the budget of NIH. And in fact, so a lot of effort across all of the 27 institutes and centers of NIH is going in and looking at this kind of issue. And we can get into it. But obviously, having access to data and software and other aspects of the research life cycle feed into the idea of the ability to be able to replicate an experiment. So the other sort of, I'm still only on disruptors, right? The other thing I've learned in the year I've been at the NIH is life is what happens when you're planning something else. This is sort of like what happens at the NIH. You've got all these plans and things you've organized, and then these other initiatives come along. So obviously precision medicine wasn't even on the horizon when I thought about going to the NIH just over a year ago. And it just emerged pretty quickly. And it emerged finally on January the 30th. Prior to that, we'd actually had, I guess I'd only been at the NIH for a very short period of time. I started in March of last year. I think I've been there less than a month. And when Dr. Francis Collins, the director of NIH, who I report to, came to me and said, we've had a request from President Obama. He wants a brief on the intersection between genomics, big data, and precision medicine. So we started preparing this thing, which was a really cool thing to do. It's really sort of funny to write something and think maybe the president's going to read it. I don't think he did in the end. I think everything I got probably got scratched out. But anyway, that led to, after several meetings and so forth, to on the 30th of January, there was this announcement post the State of the Union address that there would be $215 million allocated in FY16 to start a precision medicine initiative. So this is, as and I imagine some of you are quite familiar with this, but this is, I think, potentially quite disruptive. Not because, frankly, even though it's quite a lot of money, in the grand scheme of things, it is not a huge amount. But it's what it represents, and it potentially is just the beginning. And I've heard various people, including Francis Collins, say this could be bigger for the NIH and for others, of course, than the Human Genome Project. So, there are two parts to what's going on. It's sort of split between about a 50 million piece component that's a sort of short-term, near-term component, which really ramps up and increases the rate of doing cancer genomics. And the second part is the longer term, which is really to create a cohort of over 1 million people to actually be used in a research context. Now, that's easy to say, but doing something like this in practice, just focusing on the longer term objective, we've already had one workshop to discuss this. It's all available online from the NIH website, so all those lectures, if you're interested, if you're not caught up on some of this stuff. But clearly, this is a pretty major undertaking. But the idea is there, where it's still unclear. There's a series of, so the way this is working is that there is a working group that's been set up which reports to the NIH director that is evaluating based on a series of workshops that are going to happen over this summer to report back, I believe it's around the September timeframe, on a plan of action around precision medicine at the NIH. And clearly there's a lot to be thought about. There's the cohort itself. Where are these patients going to come from? Right? There are potential cohorts out there already, the VA, the Department of Defense, as well as, of course, those within healthcare systems. And then there's, how we go about building a system where not only do you have the electronic health record, but the intent is to either do exome or full genome sequencing on all members of the cohort, to the idea that you're going to collect mobility and electronic health data, possibly even environmental data. This is sort of an undertaking that has not really been there before. There are bits and pieces that are there, but in terms of the scope of this, it seems to me that this is a pretty new and certainly a big data problem. What will this look like? I think the idea of an early metric of success is if, by being precise in terms of how the patient is able to be interpreted, the idea that you can identify loss of function mutations against common diseases, or indeed you can actually determine resilience. So in other words, where you have patients, individuals that have all the hallmarks that they should have a particular condition, and yet they don't. This is really valuable information. And so you can imagine how you can start using this, not to mention all the other kinds of information that we're not even collecting right now. So you can begin to see how, from the point of view of someone like myself who's involved with the data side of NIH, this is exciting and represents lots of challenges and lots of opportunities in something we hadn't even considered when I actually joined up. So, just to sort of put the lid on the precision medicine piece of this, you can start imagining, and these are just hypothetical scenarios of where we might be within the context of this, of precision medicine within the next few years. So where we are right now, of course, is that a patient with type 2 diabetes may be taking a suboptimal type of therapeutic, and certainly how they monitor their glucose is potentially considered quite suboptimal. Whereas in 2 years, you can imagine as the cohort starts to build, that this person is part of that cohort. There is DNA sampling. She can get parts of her health record, in really meaningful ways. I don't mean a piece of paper. I mean something in a format that can be downloaded and uploaded into a different system. And researchers are actually engaged with the patient. So the idea is it puts the patient at the center of the process. That's really going to be a hallmark of what happens in this kind of event, in this kind of project. And in fact, the leadership of this includes someone who is essentially a patient advocate. It's got a scientist, a policymaker, and a patient advocate as people who are leading this kind of initiative. And then, you can imagine driving this further 5 years. There are new personalized drug treatments that really help, and she gets details of that. It's well known that based on her particular profile, that her ability to metabolize this drug is, less than a typical person of her taken from the cohort. So, she gets alternative dosing. And then the final thing, of course, is that this is so successful that the children of this patient, when she's now 60, want to be part of the cohort themselves. It will be interesting to see how this evolves. But the point is that this is all about patient partnerships, it's about electronic health records, it's about technologies, it's about genomics, and it's about data science. So what are we doing to sort of beginning to embrace this kind of development and this kind of possibility? We have a program at NIH that's called the Big Data to Knowledge program, which is in part of the answer to that question. And it's this past year, in its ramp-up phase, we spent, I'll tell you how we spent in a minute, but we spent over $30 million in extramural funding. This year, it's more like 80 or 90 million, and that's ramping up to be of the order of $100 million per year for the next few years to the end of the decade. And really, that is the driver of developing this kind of ecosystem that I mentioned right at the beginning. And I think there are, as we've put this together, and as we've gone around and talked to many people and worked with the communities, it's come down to a sort of strategy that really is what I like to call a three-legged stool. So there's the notion of communities, policies, and infrastructure. These three legs, all of which must move in lockstep together if we're to make progress. And I'm going to give you, on top of all of that, because that all sounds very nice, but to a PI, to a scientist working out there, these things are sort of enough to make them glaze over. What they really care about is the science they're doing and the advancement of that science through the research life cycle. So that's what we have to do, is to continue to sort of make that the centerpiece, but at the same time, underneath that, have these elements, these three pieces, that really contribute to the enterprise and facilitate it. And I'm going to give you sort of examples from each of these of how we're attempting to do that. And then, of course, there are things in the intersection associated with training, sustainability, efficiency, and I'll say a little about a couple of those anyway. But I certainly encourage you to talk to me afterwards or contact me if any of this resonates with you. But let's just put this into the context of an example. So we've been funding, the first year we funded a series of 12 data centers of excellence. And I've just picked one of these. It's a center called Enigma. And essentially this is just a recent publication for them, and I should preface this by saying, of course, a lot of this work was done before we started funding them, so I don't think BD2K could take credit for this, but it does give you an indication of where we're trying to go with some of this stuff. And this is an example. It's just a piece of work from this one group. Well, it's more than a group. But effectively, they found 5 novel genetic variants that they attribute to a particular component of brain development. So a particular area of the brain is strongly influenced by its development of it, and the morphology of it is strongly influenced by these 5 variants. That is a pretty profound finding. But to get there, they had to, first of all, this is where the 3 legs of the stool come in, they had to have a community. This is a community of over, I think, 300 researchers. So it's a very large community, and they're distributed all over the world. There are policies associated with this. So they're collaborating. There's policies associated with it. But what they had to do is, this is data that covers the translational spectrum. So there's genetic data in the form of GWAS on over 30,000 people. There's longitudinal studies that include a series of MRI scans on very large numbers of these patients, all of which had to be sort of aggregated. So it had to be homogenized, it had to be standardized, it had to be analyzed, and so on. So the idea of what we're trying to do is, there's no question that this took an inordinate amount of time and effort. So what we're really trying to do is nothing more than make that process more efficient by virtue of these sort of 3 components. So the community is Enigma, or now BD2K. Certainly the policy aspects that we need to deal with to improve this are things like improved consent methods, which I'll say a little more about. Certainly accessibility to data and sharing of data. That brings into the notion of trusted partners, and I'll give you some examples of what we're doing around these things. And also, obviously, standards and compute resources and software from the infrastructure, all really critical to this. So that's sort of an example of around those 3 elements in lockstep. But let's just look at them and where we've gone so far. So let's take the communities. So I mentioned already we funded 12 centers of excellence that cover a variety of different data types. What you just saw here is one, it's genotype to phenotype, but particularly around neurological data. We have others that are more around other areas. We have projects that are around, just around mobile health data, for example, which includes a lot of video that relates to patients and how they walk after spinal injury and so forth, this kind of thing. So there's a whole spectrum of different data types within these centers. And so each of those represents the raw material for trying to put together this kind of ecosystem. And then we funded a data discovery consortium, and I'll describe how all this fits together in a minute. And then a whole series of training awards, because that is so important. I'm not sure if I have a slide on it, but we're actually devoting a good 15% of our budget just to training, because it's so important with respect to the numbers, the supply and demand for data science folks in biomedicine is completely out of whack currently. I'll say a little more about that in a second. And we've started to meet and discuss that. I also want to sort of highlight something that happened that illustrates this idea of this disruption and bringing people from different places, but also the implications of it and things that I hadn't actually thought about when I joined the NIH. So we had a workshop. I decided it would be great if we had a workshop, and other people, Jennifer Couch and Dave Miller, put this together. But the idea was that we've got this game, let's bring in a bunch of gamers. Let's put them together with some biomedical researchers and see what happens. Well, it was 2 days of just sheer energy and delight. So you've got a whole bunch of kids, about a third of my age, all of which were probably much more wealthy than I am, getting together and listening to eminent biomedical researchers talk about their problems and what the problems they're trying to solve. And this had, we were so pleased with this, we decided we would have a funding call to actually do this on at scale and see what comes from it. But then that's when things then you start to realize, well, sometimes there are things that get in your way. So we put all this together and we just about got it out the door when I got a panicky call from one of the leadership at NIH saying, oh, I'm not sure we can do this, because a senator who remained nameless had just written an op-ed piece that said the NIH should not be playing games, it should be curing Alzheimer's disease. So, okay, well, that's not very smart. But normally I would have, until I thought about this and got there, I thought, okay, we'll just plow ahead, to hell with it. But then I realized if that person decided to go to the Appropriations Committee and start buzzing around and making noise about how non-responsive the NIH was, and doing these and irresponsible, this could have a profound effect on the NIH budget, which would trickle down and probably affect quite a few people in this room, either directly as investigators or people who are involved with products and other things that those investigators use. So there's a fragile ecosystem here that has to be taken into account when you do these sorts of things. So this is, I don't know why I'm telling you all this, but it's just something I've learned. And I've become much more appreciative of the system since I've been here. And Andrea and I can talk about this later. Okay, so moving on. So we have a whole series. I think what's interesting is the idea of what's happening around communities. I don't quite know how to characterize it, but I think there's something really interesting happening in that people are coming together in a rather spontaneous way to actually attack problems that realistically are just too big for small groups to deal with on their own. Some of them are more generalized, so for example, the Research Data Alliance. Some are more focused, like the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, which has brought, now I believe over 200 organizations. I'm actually on the steering committee for that, and I listen in on the calls, and it's very vibrant what these people are doing, and it's having quite an impact. So I think one of the things that the NIH needs to be doing is to figure out how do we foster those kinds of communities? How do we enable them? I think also we need to be thinking about what we do with communities, particularly as it comes, well, it's true of software and data and other parts of the research life cycle. Those are developed and shared among scientists without any regard for national or international borders. And yet how those developments are funded are tied explicitly to national borders or even subnational borders. So that creates a tension in the system that is somewhat problematic. And when money is tight and when there's issues of sustainability, people start to question, why are we paying for this when, we could be, let's just say, one institute of NIH, why are we paying for this when 80% of the usage is from overseas or is from other places? So I think there are these sorts of questions are being asked, and I think we need to come up with mechanisms to address this. One that we're looking at right now, and I don't want to go and say who the funders are at this point, but we're actually looking at a mechanism to fund developments in open access. So open access is out there. It's been there for quite some time, and I think it's had an impact. But from my point of view, and some of the other funders who encourage open access to the literature that results from the work that they fund, but we haven't necessarily used that content to its fullest. So the idea of sponsoring competitions to do that seems like a good idea. The idea is not to do that, have one agency do that, because this is of benefit to a whole number of agencies because they support open access. So the idea is that we gather together and we do it together. Now, it's actually harder for any one of those to fund activities in another region or another country. But when you put all that together, you just run a global competition, and then each agency just fund, and then you just rank order those folks, and you just fund them in that order. And if it happens to be that the top 3 are from Europe, then European funders fund them. If they're from somewhere else, the other funders fund them. So I think it really shows that the funders are actually working together in some way and really moving these things forward. So I think that, to me, are positive developments. There's a series of other community activities we're doing. I won't go into that, but I don't have a good answer to this question, but I do wonder how we sort of stimulate these communities in ways that we haven't. We've been meeting with other agencies, other funders, to try and understand and discuss, how we might do this. I kind of asked myself the question, are these emergent communities the societies of the modern age? And I could say what I think about societies in some way, but I won't, because I'll get myself into even more trouble than I'm in already. So that was the piece. That was one of those 3 legs of the stool. That was communities. So let's look at policies. So, the intent is, and some of this, I see policies in 2 ways. There are sort of top-down policies that have come from the federal government. There are 2 out there that are floating around right now. One is called M1313, another one is related to the Holdren Memo. The latter really says that research that's funded on public money, that should be accessible to the public. So that's a strong top-down driver. We'll say more about the implications of that in a minute. But whether those sorts of policies work is another matter. But there are other policies that actually come from the communities themselves. So those are more like bottom-up policies that would say, okay, as a community, we want to share this data. And then the NIH and others put in policies to sort of facilitate that. And I would say the genomic data sharing policy is an example of that. But policies are all, so if you look at the top-down policy, what it's going to mean in NIH speak is right now, if you write an NIH grant, if it's over $500,000 direct per year, you have to have a data sharing plan. If it's less than $500,000 a year, you don't need a data sharing plan. So what I interpret that, one way of interpreting that is by saying, well, if you only write a small grant, you're not generating any data worth sharing. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. So, but the new policies require, from the top down, require that this data be shared. So there will now be data sharing policies on all grants. So what? NSF has had those for some time. And, being as a PI, I would say that those policies were somewhat of a joke because they're not really well enforced. And so one of the things, first of all, it's totally ironic that you could have a data sharing policy that's not machine readable. So, one of the things that we're looking at is to make that data sharing policy machine readable. So that has implications. So it means that when a grant is written, that can be interpreted. And so investigator A says they're going to put data B in resource C on day D. So on day D, you can go to resource C and see where the B is deposited A, or is it A deposited B, one or the other. So you can actually close the loop automatically. And so that has implications. And I think that is the direction that we're headed. It's not too difficult to do it at the front end, in other words, to make a machine-readable data sharing plan. But right now, virtually no resource actually that retains data on behalf of the community actually also retains grant numbers, for example. So closing that loop is going to require some change, and some of this is changing people thinking differently and changing culture as well as the technical aspects of it. But this is the kind of thing we're thinking about. Another aspect of this is the idea of data citation. So it's the idea that we want to make data citable. Now, it just so happens that there's a small technical, relatively small technical nuance that favors this that's just happened. So there's an XML representation called JATS, which is used by the majority of publishers, and it's what gets ingested by PubMed and PubMed Central to retain the biomedical literature. So the people who'd worked JATS have actually written an extension that allows for a data citation. So in other words, it's a machine-readable data citation that can be represented in a variety of human-readable ways, just in the way that a citation of a paper can happen. But it allows that to be used in a machine-readable way. So it means that data citation can be added into the citation network. And to me, that makes perfect sense. Because, you can ask yourself, and I ask myself this occasionally, and if people have heard me talk before, they've heard me ask it many times. But it's the basic idea, and I'm a victim of this, that I have a paper that's been cited about 19,000 times. Okay? But no one has ever read that paper. It's a paper about a database. So why don't I just cite the data to start with instead of having people cite the paper about the data? Let's cite the data directly, make that accessible, and make it available through the citation network. So there's again, a lot of sympathy for this idea within the NIH and elsewhere. And so the idea is over time that we will encourage authors in their reports, in their bib sketches, in their papers, to actually include data citations, which can be easily resolvable. So but what it's really saying, the message behind all of that is saying, we value data in the way as a legitimate part of scholarship. Particularly if it's a situation where you write a paper and only you ever cite it, versus a data set that's downloaded and used by 100 people to write 100 papers. I mean, what's more valuable? We should be recognizing that value. So that's the basic idea of data citation. Another aspect that actually just was released about 2 or so weeks ago is the notion of being able to put dbGaP, which is the genome to phenotype database, is to have that information, is to be able to enable that information to be put into the cloud. There was a lot of worry about this, but after a lot of review and a lot of sort of munging around, it was agreed that this would indeed happen. This is actually quite a profound development from the point of view of using patient data in cloud resources in a way that it is secure. And we could talk more about that if you're interested. But I mean, that's happened already. So putting all this together, let's look at the infrastructure piece of this. So what we've done is we funded a series of centers. Each one has a virtuous research cycle, so they're doing their own research, but they're also generating data, software that they're feeding back into this ecosystem. Within this ecosystem, we've also funded a data discovery index, a means of going through and crawling and discovering these data sets. Initially in this environment of the centers, but later more generally. How that unfolds and the mechanism for that is currently being prototyped and tested. That also, exactly that same premise applies to software. Again, that says something else about software as well. It says we really need to be defined, we need good provenance for software, we need good versioning for software, and obviously some of that's going on already in resources like GitHub, but we really need to sort of up the ante on that as well. And standards. So we will, I shouldn't be saying this, but we'll soon be announcing the idea of creating some mechanism to help facilitate the development and support of standards that works in concert with frameworks for standards and support of standards that are already out there. So when you put all that together, you start building this ecosystem I was talking about in the beginning. And that exists in an environment which we're calling the commons. So the idea is that, and it's not just restricted over time to what we're funding, but it's for effectively any participant. So the idea of the commons is really this, as you would think about it in a village, it's just this shared space. It's not a new idea, but we're sort of implementing it in a certain way. And Vivian Benazzi and George Komatsoulis have been sort of really working on this. And the idea is that we define this shared space, and I'll say about what that actually means in a second. But within that, what we put in that space, we need to have some unique identification. That really is all that's implied by being commons compliant at this point. That you put this space, that you put this content into a shared space, and it's identifiable and resolvable in some way. So if that content is fairly static, so for example, it could be a data set that you've pretty much finished with that's part of that goes with a paper, then perhaps you define a DOI, a digital object identifier, to go with that. If it's more volatile, then perhaps you use something else, a different kind of handle system. And then you need a means of searching across those digital objects, which is where, in one instance, the data discovery index comes in. And then you need a computing platform to support it. And that's collectively what we call the commons. And so that commons framework, what those platforms mean, are really just these virtual spaces that exist in a variety of hardware architectures. So it could be a public cloud, it could be a private cloud, it could be an HPC facility, or indeed it could be an institutional resource, provided that that content is accessible to the indexers and you can actually go back to it. It doesn't negate any aspects associated with privacy and human subjects data, because you might actually be able to determine that such data exists through the search index, but that's not to say that you have the authority to access it. But it's, at least you know it's there, and then you can actually seek the consent should you wish. So that's sort of the model. One of the things that we're experimenting with is, and so we're conducting a series of pilots around this commons right now. One of those is really the business model, if you like, that we use to support it. So one of the notions we've been playing around with is the idea that what happens right now, you write a grant, you put in that grant a line for compute of some kind, $100,000 in your grant. What do you do with that money when you get it? Well, as a PI, I can tell you, maybe I'll siphon a bit off here, a bit off there. Maybe you won't, but you might spend it all nicely on a set of racks that you put somewhere in a machine room or under your desk or whatever it might be, and off you go. Now the problem with that is there's no mapping of supply to demand. So it may be that that equipment is overutilized, but more than likely it's underutilized. So that's why we don't have a good mapping necessarily of supply and demand. So what we're experimenting with, or going to experiment with very shortly, we sort of have the go-ahead to do this. The contractual part of this is actually probably the hardest part, and George has been working that to death, is the basic idea: we're not going to give you $100,000 to buy hardware. We're going to sweeten the pot, and we're going to give you $125,000 of credit. And you can spend that credit in any commons compliant resource you want. So what's the impact of that? Well, first of all, if you don't use all that credit, we can give it to someone else. So we're doing a better mapping of supply and demand. It also means it drives, potentially, all this is to be tested, okay? It drives competition into the marketplace. Because if you have different choices of where to spend that credit in a commons compliant resource, you're going to choose the resource where you get the best bang for your buck. So if you happen to be data rich and compute poor in what you do, then you're going to go to one provider. If you're compute rich and data poor, you might go to another provider because you get a better deal there. But it drives some level of competition potentially into the marketplace. We want to evaluate this. So this diagram, which is, it's not particularly, I won't go into the details of it, but the basic idea is we have a broker, all right? So effectively, we have a broker, and then we have a series of compliant providers, kinds of things I mentioned, HPC, public-private clouds, and so on. And so effectively, you get this credit, the broker is notified, you choose to spend some of that credit in let's just say, I'll pick one, Amazon in AWS, then AWS sends a bill to the broker, along with all the other NIH investigators who've spent funds. That then broker then sends a bill, aggregates from across all the other providers, sends a bill to the NIH, NIH pays the bill, and on we go. So what's the other implication of all that? Well, all of this stuff is sitting in the commons, it's indexed. We have a much better handle on the data and the software that are being produced by the grants that we fund. Right now, we don't know effectively, apart from the papers that are produced from it and things that go into standardized databases, we don't necessarily know. So you might put a whole bunch of stuff on your website based on a grant that you had, and that's very good, and it's sort of accessible. It's not necessarily easily findable. But then what happens over time, the grants run out. Let's face it, it's just going to, over time, it's going to atrophy. Before long, that's no longer available. Well, this way, we could even, I'm not saying we would do this, but we could actually continue to measure the usage of that content. We can't measure, if that's sitting on your website, we can't measure the usage currently. But you create some piece of software, some data, the grants run out, it's sitting in the commons, we could potentially choose to keep sustaining that even after the grant has run out if it seemed to be worthwhile on behalf of the community. So that's the sort of ideas that are going on. I won't go into this. There's work going on around standards. I think we're working out, we're going to have some kind of community-based effort to sort of aggregate the work that's going on standards. There'll be a statement of work and a contract awarded for that pretty soon. I don't necessarily want to say too much about that, but that's clearly important. And of course, the elements associated with those standards should also appear in the commons, and they should be accessible. So you can address questions. I've started generating this data. I'm new to this area. Is there a standard way of representing it? How do I find that out? These are not trivial things to do right now. Anything we can do to facilitate that would seem to be a good thing. So let me just say a couple of things about training and perhaps sustainability, and then I'll stop. If you have any questions, Andrea will answer them because I'm going to run out of here quickly. Just kidding. So we're trying to work with specialists. So the idea we're funding, these are all sort of standard NIH mechanisms. We're funding training programs to support people in data science. But we're also trying to do some new things. We're trying to work with groups like the AAU, the Association for American Universities, to actually figure out better ways of doing things. I'll just go off on a little diatribe. I know, am I running? Time's running? Oh, I won't go off on a little diatribe, but ask me about the Google bus at some point if you want to know. But I don't have time for a diatribe. But we're trying to bring in others, and I think I've tried to illustrate that. We're also, I just say, so the work we have a call out right now. It's actually out on the street. You could apply for it to develop a workforce development center. So it's really a place which is going to aggregate some of the things that are going on in the community that are important for workforce development and diversity in that workforce within the data science arena. So just one example of that is there is a lot of virtual and physical courses that are being offered that fall under this umbrella of data science. But how do you find them? How do you know how good they are? So one of the things that's emerging out of this, and again, this is a collaboration with Europeans, is to actually come up with a metadata scheme for actually describing these courses, which could then form part of an index where you could actually go, and then of course, if you want more details, it resolves to the actual course itself. So this is all stuff that's going on, and then that includes measuring the utility. So the idea is, you know, you can actually see how many people have taken these courses and so forth. So I'm going to stop there because I can see there's a certain level of agitation in the audience. But of course, this is all a huge team effort, and I mentioned Andrea already, but there are many other people at NIH involved in this. We have a pretty small team working on this, but within the 27 institutes and centers at the NIH, there are representatives from every one of those who are actively involved in this effort, and I'm very grateful to all of them. And I'm grateful to you for being so attentive. Thank you.